Just to give you a little bit of a background, I work for Kensington Health Center. I bridge pretty much two programs. I work at what's called caregiver support in the long-term care facility as part of a subsidiary, a program called Second Mile Club, where a number of social workers and I support caregivers. I support caregivers in one-on-one um, and also in groups. We have groups and these webinars. But since the pandemic has been upon us, I've also been reallocated to the hospice next door. We have, of course, a long-term care facility, but we also have a hospice next door that has 10 beds. And I provide psychosocial emotional support for residents and family members being served at the hospice, and as well as bereavement support after someone has died. And I do end up cooking a bit in the kitchen as well, and serving meals. So I have a little bit of a unique perspective on caregivers because I can see it from, or I have seen it from the perspective of somebody who's relatively transitioning to end of life. So in the last 2 to 3 months, last 2 to 3 weeks, last days, and also for longer journeys, like who are not necessarily near end of life, or even a palliative diagnosis, like somebody living with cancer and not necessarily at the stage that it's threatening their life. Anyways, it's a very unique program. I enjoy it very, very much. But my road, I've been in hospice palliative care for 30 years. So I've been working with caregivers and individuals living with life-limiting illness like cancer for a very long time. I know I don't look the part, especially with the sun that I've been getting, but I've been through quite a journey myself with caregiving. I too am a caregiver. I'm a professional caregiver, or a paid caregiver, a formal caregiver, and I'm an informal caregiver because I caregive older adults, namely my parents, who live with me, failure, and could be deemed having a palliative diagnosis in his journey. So the challenges of caregiving are not lost on me. I juggle a family, a child, and I juggle a very full work, especially now with the pandemic, and caregiving for older adults. And the interesting thing is that oftentimes older adults, it refers is corresponding with caregiving or life-limiting illnesses. But folks, there's something called young carers for individuals who are caring for somebody who they themselves are young and caring for an adult, or we could be caregiving for somebody who may not traditionally fall in the spectrum of a life-limiting illness or cancer, like somebody in their teens or 20s or 30s. So we're trying to break a lot of the myths and the ideas and perceptions around what it is to be a caregiver, because it could be any one of us at any stage of life, in any age demographic, any social economic status. So let's speak a little bit more of where I've been and what I've done. I've seen a lot of suffering, folks. I've seen a lot of pain. I've seen a lot of joy, incredible transformation, spiritual, existential becomings. I've sat at bedside of nearly hundreds, if not thousands of people in 30 years. And in many walks of life. And when you sit with people who are living with a life-limiting illness, you inadvertently support and sit with the caregivers, both formally and informal caregivers. And a lot of my work right now is on the streets of Toronto, or was until the pandemic hit, supporting with life-limiting illnesses with Dr. Nahid Dasani on the streets, and people who care for them, their chosen family, and what we call caregivers on the streets, which is a very unique, I find. Yet there is some commonalities with what we classify as traditional caregivers, although I don't really completely subscribe to the term traditional. That's something that we used to put people in boxes and say, this is what it is to be a caregiver. I actually found online, if you look online, it's really a minefield. It's really interesting. That's what I appreciate about Wellspring, is that it provides sound, good, factual, researched, knowledgeable programming, supports, and information. But online, you can find what it means to be a caregiver. How do caregivers feel? And often at times that I find that misleading, folks, because we're such individuals. We're such unique people. and we experience the challenges of being a caregiver very, very uniquely. Like if there's 7 billion caregivers in the world, there's going to be 7 billion different ways. There will be slight commonalities, but let's not get lost in the commonalities at the expense of looking at the individuality of who and what we are when we're caregiving. And that's what I'm going to wrap in this whole new normal, new beginning. Um, I've heard it many times over the years, spend as much time as I have in the field without hearing a lot. But I've really brought it to the forefront because a lot of the caregivers that I support right now use this terminology to describe things that are very unique to them. And I want to hopefully engage you today with some of this terminology and what it means to you. Unfortunately, I mean, Zoom is great because we can have access across the country, but unfortunately, I would love to have this discussion because then we can actually have a discussion with it. So please feel free to ask the questions. And as Vanita said, I will answer them on the fly because I will post some questions to you, if that's all right, with your autonomy. Obviously, you don't have to answer, about new normals and new beginnings. So I don't know if any of you have heard of this. What is a new normal in comparison to what is a new beginning for our lives as we travel the journey being a caregiver for someone, a loved one, or a family member, or someone we're caring for who has cancer? All right, has anybody heard of these terms? A new normal, a new beginning? Has anybody come across them in their lives? And as I present this, if I can ask you to see how it relates to your lives, right? And I'll ask you some questions in terms of what you experience or perceive as normal, a normalcy in your life, what has changed in that normal, how does it interface with a new beginning, especially after diagnosis, how that new beginning can constantly reinvent itself through the journey of a cancer diagnosis of a loved one. So these are some questions I ask you before we even defined normality and beginnings. Are new normals and new beginnings in the journey of a caregiver, are they the same? To have a new normal and to have a new beginning, are they the same or are they different? Are they different experiences, different time frames, different parts of the journey? I've seen both, actually. Can they coexist? Can you have new normals and new beginnings interlace and interface one another and coexist at the same time, depending on perception? Do they interchange to something that's considered normal and change to something a new way of being? Is that considered a beginning? Can they interchange? Are they part of the same continuum? Does one come and then the other come? Does one change and then the other changes? And how do you recognize these states for yourselves individually? What is a new normal and what could be classified as a new beginning? So let's start with a new normal. What does it mean? Does anybody have any ideas? I want to ask that to you. Just put it in a question and answer if you'd like. What does it mean to have a new normal? If you've heard of it. And even before we get to that definition, can I define to you what normal is according to Merriam-Webster? And of definitions. What's a definition of normal? And check this out. Just see how this relates to maybe your experiences. Normalcy or normal is something conforming to a type, a standard, or a regular pattern. Okay. So traditionally, something has a regular pattern to it or is a standard can be considered a normal. So how has that changed to something new when you were a caregiver? There's also a part 2 to the definition, something that's occurring naturally. So although we've normalized the experience or we've tried to normalize the experience of having a diagnosis. Oh, I love it, Elena. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. My new normal, right? Yeah. How someone can step up in caregiving and become the rock, and then they become. But what is it though? Like, what is it about that? And they occurring naturally. So to have a diagnosis that's life limiting, to have cancer, is that outside of what is natural? right? Or do we consider it something different or something, you know, we are pathologizing of it, or can we classify it as a different form of just being alive, right? And that's just trying to wrap around what's considered normal to keep away from the judgments. You know, like we used to, you know, check out the language, right? The new normal. I've heard this from a caregiver. My new normal is to be classified as a caregiver for somebody who has cancer, and she felt like she lost who she was. Her new normal was caregiver, and she lost who she was. You know, and is that fair? Is that okay? Is she classifying it, or she, and the way she described it is that her new normal was what people saw of her. Okay, so we'll get into a little bit more of that. So look at some other ideas of a what would be a new normal. Is it is it a destination? Like, is it something that you get to a new normal? Like, this is the start of it right here, or is it a moving target? And what I mean by a moving target, does it constantly, do we constantly have new normals? You know, for example, a new normal could be at the time of diagnosis, right? This is our new norm, right? Living with the memory of this is the norm now. My husband, wife, partner, son, daughter, grandparent has a palliative diagnosis, has a cancer diagnosis. It lives in our thoughts, it lives in our experiences, it becomes part of our conscious awareness. It could actually set a new reference point. So the new normal is that new reference point that everything changed from this, right? What about treatments? The new normal, I've heard from caregivers, is that the new norm is that we expect to have treatments. We expect to be going to treatments. We expect it's part of our daily life. Another aspect of new normal is self-perception, right? Is how do I perceive myself? What I've grown up to believe, what I've grown up to be. Like this individual caregiver, she said, I still see myself as, you know, Lois, but everybody perceives me as the wife of the husband who has cancer. That's my new norm. And when I see it in people's eyes, that's what is changing even my self-perception, whether I, when we talk about the norms, you know, everybody heard of these terms called norms, right? The norms is that I am this or I am that, or, and then all of a sudden there's this cancer diagnosis, and you know, there's this lack of normalcy. It becomes, and the way we classify it or we feel about it is that we call it a new norm in order to avoid the judgment of it being abnormal. See the difference, right? What about roles? You know, I've heard from caregivers saying, you know, since my wife got sick, the new norm is that I do, you know, all the shopping, all the work. I had to go back to work. I do all the bills now because I didn't do that before. She took care of everything, right? She was the primary breadwinner. So the new norm is that this is what I do, right? And even if it comes down to health, caregivers are notorious for not being able to, you know, care for themselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and all those aspects. So it affects their health. And one caregiver told me her new norm was that she was second when it came to her health. That's her idea of what a norm was. It's almost like a reference point, folks. What's the new normal is it can crystallize and solidify and become a place for which we compare everything, a before and an after. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of time. Um, what was normal before has changed to what is normal now, and the before and after is sometimes the challenge in terms of defining what we do here and now. And what I mean by that is that we look for reference points. Oftentimes, is that time. What was before the diagnosis is very different from what is after the diagnosis, and what is in the future with the diagnosis, right? And for example, you know, whether there's remission or stabilization, or you know, somebody ends up, you know, dying of the disease, the norm or the new normal is the expectation of that, is the looking to the future. Whereas before the diagnosis, I never, you know, we didn't look to the future because there was nothing threatening our future, right? Nothing concrete that was threatening our future. Now we look to the future, and the norm is that this piece of it is in our lives. It becomes our reference point. And the feelings, like, in terms of how we feel, can be exasperated by repeats back up to the diagnosis and treatments, and how people perceive us and the changes in lifestyles. So I've heard from caregivers for the first time in their lives is that the new norm is self-expression. They're in touch more with how this feels, because the feelings are so strong, right? They can be so strong in terms of joy and appreciating and acknowledging every moment they have with their loved one, or the pain of watching their loved one suffer, or the anticipatory grief in how this affects them in losing their loved one, especially in cases of cancer that affected by dementia. So, can I ask you, do you have a normal? Like, do you classify something as a normal? And what is your normal? What is your normal? Or do you have a normal? I know mine. I know absolutely my dad's first heart attack, right? It was never, nothing was ever the same after that. My new normal became that, I classified myself as, this is what I have to do for the rest of my life. So my norm is that when I go home every night, I got stuff to do for him, right? That's my norm. That's where it crystallized, and there was a distinct change from what was to what is. Now, I'm also personally challenged by that, because I feel like life is a continuum. I feel like there's there's always change in our lives, but for some reason, maybe it's obvious to you, that there was a reference points of change of what was previously considered my normal life and what is now. And I chose to classify it as a new normal in order to absolve myself, or not to judge myself in the abnormality of it, of being, a younger person caregiving for a family member. And that was 10 years ago. So maybe it's more accepted, more acknowledged nowadays, but it's not always been like that. By the way, hey Barbara, I got your question. I saw you. Your message. Let's move a little bit, folks, to new beginnings. Okay, what does it mean? What does a new beginning mean to you, or what does it mean in terms of caregivers? Right. I hear this a lot, actually, from caregivers, and it's not often I hear from caregivers new normal beginning. I usually hear either a new normal or a new beginning. And I never forget this caregiver that I was supporting. She said, it's a new beginning for us. I was like, when did that start? She said, when he had his first treatment. And because the ritual changed, the schedule changed, the roles changed. For her, she said, this is the first day of the rest of my life. And that's just the perception of how she saw it, in terms of, and when I asked her a little bit more about what it meant to have the first day of the rest of her life, she said, we're going to be fighting for the rest of our lives now. This is the beginning. This is the beginning. And I said, would you classify it as a new beginning? She says, yeah, I was born, and then he had his first treatment. Those are the two beginnings in my life. Nothing's ever the same after that. So you see how it can be perceived and recognized in our experiences. So let's define beginning first. Beginning is at a point at which something starts. Okay. This is a Merriam-Webster definition, actually. A point at which something starts. So oftentimes a new beginning, I've heard from caregivers, is at the time of diagnosis, at the time of treatment, at the time of loss of independence, a time of self-classification as a caregiver, at the time of death, right? At the time of going into a facility or a hospital. There's another way to define it. It's called the first part. So the first part, and then if you have a first part, you might have a second part. Oftentimes I've heard caregivers define the first part was this stage of our lives, and the second part is this, and the third part is this. And in those parts, I often see, especially with late stage diagnosis of cancer, is the loss of functionality, the loss of ability, the advancement of the disease. And you could also be defined as early period or stage. So sometimes new beginnings are, again, diagnosis, pre-diagnosis, post-diagnosis. Do you see those in folks? Do you recognize those at all? The new beginnings, the new normals. Do you ever perceive those in your lives? Just let me know if you come across it. I would love to engage you in the discussion. So let's move on to, again, a new beginning. Is it a destination? I've heard from some caregivers, they say, my life will begin again when my partner dies or when my mother or father dies because I'm caregiving for them and it's just so much on my life. I'm home all the time and I'm taking care of them. So my new beginning is when they die. Or is it something that's moving? That's almost every day, if not every moment. A practice in mindfulness is new beginnings are the beginning of an ending, meaning almost in every moment. Or it could be the stages of the trajectory of illness or the challenges within the day. Oh, we have a question. I'm going to read this aloud, folks, because I like to carry on this discussion. Words that mean the same but sound so much more hopeful. What do they say? A new beginning is a painful ending in disguise. Yes, I have that quote, but I respect the person that brought that forth, but I have my own take on it. Let's make sound more hopeful. Painful endings are just new beginnings in disguise. So are they folks like is there such thing, especially in caregivers? Because I don't believe caregivers ever stop being caregivers even after their loved one has died. Do you know why I don't believe that? Is because there can be a new beginning in terms of our perception, but we carry the memory. So what of the person who we've been caring for, and sometimes it becomes programmed in our minds to be a caregiver. It becomes part of our self-perception or self-critique before and after the death of a loved one. And even though the person has left us, they've died, the caregiving becomes habituated to the memory of the loss. So oftentimes caregivers revert back and say to me, I'm still caregiving for the memory. I'm still for their memory. I'm trying to keep their memory alive. I'm trying to create legacy and what have you. So the beginning may only be perceived as such, but the feeling of it is that it's continual. So it can be hopeful, yes, anonymous attendee, or it may also, it depends how you define hope. Let me just get back to this. So let's talk about a little bit about new beginnings when it comes to diagnoses, right? I've heard this from people I've supported as caregivers. It's never going to be the same after this. So what was perceived before, what was felt before, is that life was on this trajectory, and then all of a sudden it took a right left-hand turn, and it will never be the same since this time, right? This is our new beginning. So that's one way to classify it. But you can also see a flavor of a change in normalcy of what is normal with that. Treatments. When it comes to treatments, I've heard caregivers say our new beginning in terms of treatments is that we will have treatments. And if we don't have treatments, we're going to wait till we have treatments. If we're not having treatments and we don't have to wait for treatments, we're always going to be in anticipation of treatments. This is our new beginning. Some caregivers have classified their new beginning in terms of self-perception. I am never going to be the same again. After this diagnosis, it has shattered my world that someone who is so good to the world is now sick, is now suffering, is now, fighting this disease. So the perception is that I am never going to be the same because I've lost trust. My new beginning began today, right? Once there was this diagnosis or once there's been a decline in health. For some, the new beginning is that lifestyle. I've heard from caregivers say, lifestyle's completely changed now. We were going to retire. We were going to travel. I was going to become a golf professional. And now my lifestyle has changed. My beginning is that I have to, check this out, have to adopt this new normal in my life. And it infuses how I lead my life now. It begins forth. For some caregivers, the new beginning is a change in roles. And that includes myself. A new beginning was that I learned how to become an informal caregiver. It's become my new normal, but it also began me on a different journey. So I have a distinct time and place of when life changed for me. It was my new beginning because it took me into the field, not as just an informal caregiver caring for two informal adults, but also professionally. I started really engaging in it as for a living. I see there's another question, especially in terms of health. I've heard from some, if not many, caregivers as a result of the person they're caring for having a diagnosis of cancer, is that they began to really monitor their own health. They felt immune. Oftentimes we do, and this was actually a younger carer, felt immune. And then when they saw their parent get sick, they said, it's time for me to monitor my health and be very mindful of the reference point of what brought that awareness to me, that I have to monitor my health. For some, it's the future. The reference point is from here. We were going this way. The future holds this now for us. We begin now. We are self-analyzing. We are self-critiquing our lives now for a future with this disease, with this fighting, working through, processing, living through this disease. However, you also heard from many caregivers who come to our groups now, is their new beginning was when they recognized how caregiving made them feel, how watching their loved one live with cancer made them feel. And fed back into a new sense of self, because in some altruistic way, the experience of being a caregiver got them in touch with aspects and feelings because they were so intense and full and exasperated that they'd never paid much attention to before. What about you folks? Like, have you experienced what you would classify as a new beginning as a caregiver? And I'm going to answer this question now as well. Let's see. It's from Elena. Thank you, Elena. Here's a difficult question for you. All the questions are difficult, but they're all the welcome. Throughout your 30 years of experience, how often have you seen a life-threatening diagnosis precipitate a divorce? 2030. Do men break up more than women? So interesting you mentioned that, because I was divorced about 7-8 years ago, 2 or 3 years after my father became very ill. And part of it was that I was caregiver. So it split me into 5 different pieces, right? And a big part of my heart was caregiving for my family, and it took a toll on my marriage. Rightfully or wrongfully, I don't pass any judgment on it. Do men break up more than women? I couldn't provide you with the stats. I just know that for the most part, and today it's changed, but for the most part, 60 to 7% of caregivers in Canada are women. That's a stat that I could provide for you. Do they end up in divorce? It's really hard to say, Elena, because divorce is such a there's so many factors to divorce. I can't begin to answer the percentages on that, but I can tell you that it does end up sometimes precipitate in divorce for a number of reasons. It could be, somebody wanting by the new normal of caring for a spouse, and what that can mean. It can definitely end up in separation, divorce, alienation, withdrawal, a number of those. So yes, I definitely have seen it, and I would have to say that I'm a product of it, to be completely and perfectly honest and vulnerable. Right. Thank you for your question. So, folks, can I ask you? We had a couple of good questions. What have you experienced that in your caregiving journey, where there has been a perception of a new beginning for you? Have you felt it? Have you thought, you know what, this is the beginning of everything now? I've heard that from caregivers. There is no past. This is it. This is the new. Maybe not there isn't a past, but the past is different now because no, actually that caregiver said it. She says the past is forgotten. There's no past. There is now only, and everything that happens from now. This has changed our entire lives. Is there any perception that you've experienced that, a new beginning, a thought of a new beginning, or however you classify that? I welcome you to put it into questions and answers. So, folks, for me, humbly, hopefully I share it, I feel the normalcy, a new normal and a new beginning interface with one another. I feel they're actually, I feel that they're actually part of the same tree as in the picture and the depiction that you see. Um, when I'm faced with challenges as a caregiver, when I see caregivers faced with some of the challenges of being a caregiver, I look at it as what is the reference point right now? Where are they right here now? It's because it's almost as if the new normal changes moment by moment, day by day, week by week. I try to guide caregivers to be in a place of a flexibility and malleability when it comes to what they classify as normal. Oftentimes, the normal is a reference point to what has been lost, right? What was considered normal and what is the new normal involves a piece of loss, a piece of change, right? Can you see that? And that precludes further change. So the normal is actually a moving target. And in each new normal, there's a new beginning. And then possibly not so much as an ending, but another change that precludes a new beginning. So in the trajectory of a living with a cancer diagnosis, you'll have infinite number of new normals. Things will constantly be changing, as you can probably attest to. Each one creates a different normalcy if we're able to create that normalcy before it changes. And I'll talk about grounding it and being present with it. And each change has a beginning. In that beginning, it's a new beginning. And that's why I feel that the two normalcy, the new normal and the new beginning are interlaced as we travel the trajectory of a of a cancer diagnosis. Let me speak more to that. And it really is a matter of perception on your part as a caregiver. What do you see as normal for you as an individual? And that's something that I focus on when I support caregivers, because to classify what is normal for all caregivers is really dismissing what's individual for each and every one of us. What is the reference point? Where have you been and where you feel you're going to? And when you stop and take a breath, where are you? That is your normal. And that will be your new normal until it itself changes. And we're constantly changing, we're constantly evolving, right? As individuals, as people. And the challenges that are in as being a caregiver almost, I don't want to say force, but encourage, push us, demand of us to constantly change. The demands of experiencing the feelings of being a caregiver, the challenges of being a caregiver, cause us almost to have a change of what was to what is. And that once was almost our normal, right? Our natural occurrence to what is now, which is something that we become habituated to. And the same thing with beginnings. For some, it's in the perception of in caregivers. What is a beginning becomes an end. And I'm very sensitive with that because endings um, preclude grief and loss. And if endings are tied to beginnings, then there's grief and loss and a lot of feelings. Beginning may have an ending, but let's be mindful. If that's the case, as somebody mentioned, I think it was you, Elena, then let's be mindful that, or the anonymous attendee, let's be mindful that a new beginning can have a grief experience to it until it settles into a sense of a new normal. And even then, it could still have experiences of grief and experiences of loss and feelings as related as such. And very much in caregiving, when it comes to normals and beginnings and endings, it's in our perception and even in our fingerprint, in our individuality of what that really means. And I mean, I could blanket a lot of stuff today. I just ask you to start thinking about the movement of what is normal for you. Where do you hold on to what was perceived as normalcy, to have some structure and some base and some security and stability? Because moving to a new normal, or what has pushed us to a new normal, can involve a loss of structure and a loss of base. and can preclude a new beginning, right? A new beginning way of life, a new role, a new way of expression, a new lifestyle, but without negating the emotions that are involved in that are often grief and loss. It's very individual. Each and every one of us will have a multitude of interlaced new beginnings and new normals that only we can identify. And folks, I don't believe in denial. I'm sorry, I know it's been popularized. I don't believe in the terminology of denial, but not so much denial. Somewhere in our unconscious, subconscious minds, we know what's going on. We're in touch with what is happening, although maybe in our conscious minds, we're being protected from it. And why I bring that to you is because of what we perceive as new normal and new beginnings. And I'll speak a little bit to the euphemisms. Sometimes we can dissociate from what is happening now because it doesn't feel like what it once was. However, we classify it as our new norm because it is what it is. And the important piece in that is to recognize our emotional state, our psychological state in that, because it's what is in front of us as precluded or as reference to what once was. So just to bring that all back together, moving from what once was, especially as a caregiver, because there's constant change, to what is happening right now, really has, whether you classify it as new normals, new norms, new beginnings, endings, it's a movement. It's a movement that exercises a lot of emotion, a lot of psychological, mentally, psychosocial, spiritual, existential expressions, and it's constantly changing. And I hope we can bring it to a sense of awareness and mindfulness of what those beginnings and endings, those new normals, those reference points mean to us individually and have a place to put them. And that's why here at Kensington Health, we have a caregiver program, and that's why Wellspring is very, very strong proponent of and advocate for caregiver programs to give you a space with which you can explore new norms, new beginnings, and endings, and the emotional, psychosocial experiences of those. Of So let's talk a little bit about the strategies and tools in navigating new normals and new beginnings. One thing I'm very mindful of supporting with caregivers is changeability. It's like a dynamis. Every moment is almost a new normal. We just don't recognize it, I think, as much before we come to caregiving. When we become caregivers, it's almost as if the changeability, the dynamic nature of that which we're engaging, supporting somebody who has cancer, creates constant new normals because there's loss. There's losses of all that I talked about: lifestyle, self-perception, time, money, you name it. There's a great deal. So there's constantly new normals. We're constantly adjusting to what we perceive as normal, while at the same time often facing the perception of family and friends and society of the abnormality of it, right? Because it's not what everybody faces. And the same thing with new beginnings. There's a changeability to it, whether it's you classify it every moment, or for example, you attend a group and you get strategies. You go to your loved one or your person you're caring for, and you implement them, and all of a sudden there's a change in the way you're able to navigate the caregiver journey. Or it means divorce, as Elena mentioned, right? Or separation, or withdrawal, or an ending such as remission, that we're not dealing with cancer anymore for the present time, or a death, right? Let's just be mindful of the changeability, and the whole notion of new beginnings and new normals speaks to the changeable nature. And anytime there's a change, there's emotions involved with that change. And one of the most common emotions, as I mentioned, is grief, right? The emotion of attached with loss. And loss and grief are not just death related, folks. You might know, like it's all that's experienced in losing something, right? And again, I go back to this, and I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, as my mother used to say, is that when we have new norms and we have new beginnings, we have experience of losses in them, right? Because something's changing, something's lost to become something else, or to transform into something else. And that's my second point there that I hope we're being mindful of. It's the emotions involved with new normals and new beginnings, right? As they interface. I recognize also with caregivers is that when something is classified and when something's changed and we try to normalize it and we call it a new norm, sometimes it's a time to adjust for the mind and the heart for what once was and what is now and all that's involved in what's now. Because our minds are like little computers. They get programmed into some way of being and living and acting and thinking and feeling. So when we have a new normal, because of whatever it may be, that new normal needs time to be programmed in our brains. And even with new beginnings, I advocate for caregivers if their loved one is living with cancer and there's a chance in the next 6 months of death to permission themselves to think about a new beginning, right? And it's very hard, and it can be guilt-ridden, and can be a lot of feelings of betrayal, but it's also very normal, right? Our bodies are programmed that way to think of a future, to think of a time of self-preservation. What am I going to do when they are not with me anymore? It'll be a new beginning for me, a new beginning with a new normal, but with a past, right? And it takes time just to adjust to that and that state of being. And also to gain something called traction. I use this a lot in caregiving. It's anytime you have a shift to a different way of living, a new normal, a new norm, or you feel like it's a new beginning in a trajectory of being a caregiver, there needs a moment of traction where you can actually get a grip. I've heard caregivers call it, I call it traction, but I heard of them just to get a grip, to get a handle on things, right? And getting a handle on things can be part of what's called a new beginning and becoming the new norm, right, for what is happening right now. I ask caregivers just to be present and mindful of the emotional, psychosocial experience of it. What do you feel? What do you think when that happens? Can you create space for it? Can you recognize it in your body? Can you see how it permeates through your body, how it affects you? And hold space for that and be there with it, because these as I think it was Elena, or these hopeful or these positive ways of thinking about things can also create emotion, right? And I'm not for positive or negative thought patterns. I'm just saying this is what it is, and to be pain, it could be guilt. Let's just create a space for it. And caregiver support, that's what we do, create a space for that, because new beginnings and new normals can create emotion, can create exasperation. Oh, Vanita, are we still good? I see this saying that. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I think you cut out for a little bit and then it froze and then you're back.
Yeah, this internet. I'm sorry, folks. What can I say? And anyways, and then there's expectations. I've seen this interlaced with new beginnings and new normals often. So I think for most of us, we have plans, goals, lives, expectations of who we are, what we're going to become, what we've been, what we hope for the future. And in new normals and new beginnings, those expectations are often challenged, right? We learn to modify or manage our expectations because the beginnings and the new normals challenge those expectations. They affect those expectations, and they can cause experiences of loss and grief because the expectations are not what they once were. New normals, new beginnings also create mistrust in expectations, because if we thought, for example, I've heard from this caregiver, he said, well, I plan to do this with my partner for our retirement or our lives. All of a sudden, my expectations have completely changed. Then I don't trust to have expectations anymore. My new normal is a lack of expectations, right? And this is the beginning for me. And as he framed it, which was very challenging, is the beginning of the end, which he felt of his life as it. I've heard these folks many, many times. I found them online as well, and I just wanted to bring them to point. It actually was in an article about new beginnings, and I just bring them to be mindful of them, because if you hear them, I hope you can recognize that they're not the greatest, right? I don't think they are. I don't use them at all. I don't really gain any appreciation for them. So when we talk about, especially about new beginnings and new normals, I'm very mindful of saying tomorrow is a new day to start over. Well, we might not have tomorrow, and why start tomorrow? Why not just be mindful of it right now, right here, today? In the work that I do, we don't really look to the tomorrow for a new beginning, because the person may not have tomorrow, or tomorrow the symptoms may be worse, or tomorrow there may be a change in the trajectory of the illness. They might, so I'm very mindful of that. Here's another one I've heard. Um, each day is an opportunity for a new beginning. Yeah, true. I was up pretty early this morning and I saw the sun rise, and it was a new beginning. But for somebody living with cancer and a person caring for them, is today a new beginning, or just a considerable norm for what's been happening to them? And or is it another experience of loss for today? And the new norm, has been not always in a positive, I've heard many times, but the new norm has been constant experience of loss, right? Day by day, as a person traverses the trajectory of an illness. I've also heard one day at a time. Yeah, I can appreciate that. Where sometimes it can be to placate or pacify the feelings. But just to be mindful where we're grounded in that. Where are you grounded in that? Meaning, is it in the present moment? Is it here and now? And where's the new normal and new beginning for you? That's individual to you. I'm challenged with this one, folks. I've heard this from caregiver. I've heard this been backfired to caregivers, saying with each new beginning you can learn something. And she says, I don't effing want to learn something. I want my husband, wife, parents, son, daughter back, right? And so her new normal was the fact that she had to constantly experience this pain in her heart, right? Or you get stronger. The new normal is that I will get stronger. If that classifies for you, by all means. If that creates resilience for you, by all means. But I'm very mindful of that euphemism when it comes to the new beginnings. Tomorrow is a new day, and you'll be stronger, right? So maybe many of you as caregivers have heard that. I've definitely heard that over and over again in my personal life and professional life, that it doesn't always make you stronger. It can actually make you weaker and more susceptible to the stress. And the gain appreciation. Yeah, I'm mindful of that. New beginnings and new normals, especially new beginnings, can be classified as gaining appreciation for the present moment and day. But with some of the emotions of an experience of loss, I've heard caregivers saying, I don't appreciate these feelings. So the new beginning and my new normal is not appreciating, not wanting to appreciate the emotion. Another question. Let me just check in there and see what we got. Yeah, I hear you, Alena. I hear you. I don't like those generic euphemisms, but they're very real. And I don't know if many of you as caregivers have heard them. I have. I've heard them in caregiving for my parents, and I've heard them for caregivers in general. People say these to them. Yeah, absolutely. We need real tools, right, to get through a difficult process, not just euphemisms, but they're out there. I mean, if you look at some of the stuff online, they're being used to support caregivers. All right. So what I ask caregivers, especially when it comes to their perception of or their experiences of new beginnings and new normals, what they classify individually as new beginnings and normals, what I try to do is create space for them to experience and put forth and share and have acknowledged and validated the feelings and the thoughts surrounding what is their new normal, what is their new beginning, because it definitely has emotions to it. I ask caregivers, what brings you comfort? Explore that. What would bring you comfort or understanding, especially when there's the perception or the feeling of a new beginning, right? What brings forth an awareness, grounding, an awareness of what is normal to you now, right? And I appreciate the word normal because I don't want to pathologize it. What do you how do you feel about yourself here and now? What are some of the here and now as a caregiver that are different from what once was, right? And in that emotion or that space to permission our experience of it comes the peer support peer support caregiver groups. That's a piece of it, because in that validation of that awareness comes almost the acknowledgement and of what it is to be experiencing constant new normals, constant new beginnings, constant change, repeated experiences of loss and grief, as a caregiver. And how do you classify hope? Like, how do you classify what is hopeful for you? Because in the experience of hope, oftentimes it starts as a perception of a new beginning, or a new normal. And what is it that you are hopeful for? Because when we think of what we might be hopeful for, there can be just a lining of that cloud of what could also still be lost, right? And to be able to hold those two polarities. Because as one caregiver told me, her new normal was, feeling hopeful, but also being apprehensive and worrying that her hopes will not come forth. That was her new normal, is being able to hold those feelings. And can it build resilience? Like, can that, or I've seen it with caregivers, the resiliency comes from acknowledgement and validating what they experience as things change into new normals and new beginnings. And it helps them cope. How it helps them cope is that it allows the emotions a space, or the feelings and thoughts a space, to be heard, to be supported, to be acknowledged and validated, which lowers the fight or flight response, which lowers their hyperarousal experience. They're feeling jacked up and stressed about it, and prevents an aspect of traumatization as a caregiver, which we talked last month. And this brings us to something right now, folks, which is the pandemic. I've heard from many caregivers that their new normal, right, was the feeling of being robbed, right, because of the restrictions. And I'm very much a proponent of the restrictions and the safety practices. I work in long-term care in a hospice. We have to have these in place, and masks and what have you, absolutely. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge what caregivers feel and experience when it comes to especially feeling robbed. What their new normal was a loss of time, that they were running out of time. And they felt their new beginning was when COVID hit. That was their new beginning. And I ask caregivers to acknowledge that, to acknowledge, even with all the practices in place and the laws and the way we're managing this, to also permission themselves to feel how the new norm, which is wearing a mask, right? That's an example of a new norm. Has brought to their caregiving experience, has brought to their, as one caregiver said, it just diminished the quality of life for their loved one. The new norm of being constantly hypervigilant to being infected with a virus was what she felt robbed her of time with her loved one. I've also heard from caregivers that the new beginning was at the time of the start of the pandemic, because it changed completely their caregiving experience. So I just ask caregivers, in an unconditional, positive regard, in a safe space, to maybe permission themselves to, especially in groups or in one-to-one programs like we have here, to tell it as it is for them, right? What was their new normal when COVID hit as a caregiver? One caregiver, her new normal was that she never went out anymore. Now that was how she framed her new normal, right? Or what was the new beginning in terms of loss of quality of life, right? Just it's important for us to validate and have a space and permission ourselves to experience it, to feel it, to have it acknowledged as caregivers. And why I constantly go to that, folks, and why I harp on it, is because caregivers are, for the most part, invisibly heard. They're not heard. They're not. That's why we have these programs. They're not acknowledged in their experiences. It's usually the focus is on the person with the cancer, or somebody but not necessarily the person caring for them. And especially now with COVID, it's actually exacerbated that experience. And for me, that's the opening of the door for my caregiver role, folks, in multitude of ways. Is that every as a change in normal. It's everything is new and old almost simultaneously. The normal keeps changing. And I'm very mindful of that. I'm very nimble on that. I dance in that. I've lasted 30 years in this field as a professional caregiver, as a personal caregiver. I didn't recognize or try to develop the agility to be very present with the change in norms, in normalities. And the change in beginnings and the emotions and experiences associated with beginnings and its sister relative endings. I support that when I work with caregivers and support caregivers. That's a big part that we work on, is the malleability, the flexibility to adopt to change, sometimes on the fly, sometimes immediately, sometimes quickly, because the challenges of caregiving can be as such. And I don't want to provide like a cookie cutter approach saying this is how you do it, right? I want you folks to, if I can, just to advocate for you to think about it, to hold it, and then be able to join us in groups at Wellspring or at Kensington to learn the strategies, to really learn the strategies. This is really more, I can't teach this or do this all in an hour and a half. It's so individual, and there's 10 or 20 or 30 of you out there that it's very individual. Each one of us learns that nimbleness, that flexibility of the dance between constant new normals and constant new beginnings, in person or in one-on-ones. It's a learned skill, and it's a evolving and modified skill. And here you are. I think it was Elena that brought this up, or somebody brought this up. New beginnings are often disguised as painful endings. Can I just modify that? That's a very famous quote by this 6th century philosopher. It's a very famous quote. Yeah, new beginnings can have painful endings, but how about we just classify it as new beginnings have associated endings? And in associated endings, often why they're disguised is because the ending transitions maybe to a beginning, right? Or maybe there's an even that, if we want to get really philosophical. There's just a continuum of new norms, right? That there's an associated feeling and emotions, and emotion means that there's that movement of feeling through these experiences, through these stages of living, and especially as being a caregiver. So although I happen just to put that in there, I'm not completely a proponent of it, because in essence, in conclusion, I feel our beginnings, our endings are almost simultaneous. They're just constantly creating new normals, new norms, and then to be mindful and aware, and hopefully have it acknowledged and validated in some setting of the emotions and the thoughts that are associated with that continuum. Thank you, folks. I left a little bit of time for some questions. Let's see what we have. Yeah, Elena, have some more questions. Let's admit the caregiving process can break you and make you depressed. We're not denying that at all, but that doesn't apply to everybody, right? That may apply to yourself, but for others, caregivers, they can have a very different experience. And it also, I would love to speak to you one-on-one, what it means to break you, right? What it means to be broken by being a caregiver. No doubt, the tax is heavy, and it can very much lead to experiences of depression. And I'd hope that you can find somewhere, if not us, somewhere where you can share the experience and the load, because even in the sharing, sometimes it can not necessarily provide strategies and skills, because for some caregivers, there is no solution to it. Just what it feels to you. What is the experience for you? If I may read this, given that you have shown such a resilient and positive attitude with your 30 years of caregiving, can you share some of your personal strategies to go through the day? Thank you so much. Sure, Elena. I wouldn't say I have a positive attitude. I wish I did. I'm on camera right now, so, but I've been very challenged through the years. The one biggest strategy that I use daily in terms of being a caregiver is I really acknowledge what's changed, and I acknowledge my experience in what's changed, and then I time for the change to become a new normal. I acknowledge what has begun and what could be ending. So I look at the ending before the ending is coming, and I anticipate the beginning before it begins, because they create emotion, right? We call that anticipatory grief. We call that anticipation. Even the thought of something in the future can create emotions. So I'm just very mindful of those, and then I use strategies to navigate those emotions. I journal, I write, I talk, I harbor the feelings and feel them, really, really feel them. I share them with colleagues. I find ways with which to be able to. Oh, there's my boss, just on a webinar. um, she looks lovely today. I just find ways with which to experience those emotions, and be with them and acknowledge them and validate them. But again, I just go back to the point. I'm very mindful. Where I find caregivers sometimes we get lost or stuck or challenged is we're so caught up, and rightfully so, in the caregiving that we lose track of what's coming. Right, the perception of what's coming, the perception of the changes that are happening, what would be perceived as a new beginning or an ending coming, and to give ourselves time for a sense of normalcy, a grounding to settle in. For example, I'll just give you an example. My dad couldn't walk for a few months, so my new normal was having to be home more, right? Which was very challenging for me because I have a very full. But I gave myself a moment of time and presence and awareness of what it felt like to be home more caregiving for him and not be at work, rather than to just plow through it, just to push through it, repress that emotion, which can also sometimes result in some mental health, some depression, some sadness, some repressed emotion can sometimes even infuse our minds with thoughts that are less than constructive. So I hope that helps, Elena. You're more than welcome to contact me, actually, folks, if you'd like. I have my contact details here. I'm more than happy to speak to you by phone, by email, and I will be sharing this presentation, if you like, with Vinita, so that you're more than welcome to look at it. Most of it is pretty pictures, but I'm happy to engage in further discussions about new normals, new beginnings, and new endings. So I hope that helps you today with your caregiving role. And my fullest respect and love to you all for the great capacity you are sharing. If it wasn't for informal caregivers, let alone formal caregivers like PSWs, but if it wasn't for us informal caregivers that are caring for people at home, our healthcare system would absolutely collapse. So I hope you all stay safe and keep well, and hopefully we'll hear from you.